Boardroom Bound, episode 166, How ESG Competencies Create Future-Ready Boards, with Fredrik Otto.
How much of that sustainability, of that CSR or ESG component do you actually pay attention to? And then when you roll out your strategies, how much of that actually translates down into your organization?
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Fredrik Otto, and he is the founder of the Sustainability Board Report, and it's an independent nonprofit think tank that examines the relationship between sustainability, leadership, and corporate governance. And we're going to hear some fascinating insights from, they have an annual report that comes out. They also have a future-ready report about 2030, what sustainable business leadership will look like. We'll do a deep dive in the boardroom. And he's also got a teaser for their latest report that's coming out about the best companies in the future for ESG, the top 10 companies. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Fredrik Otto, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Hi, Alexander. Great honor to be here today. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted this worked, and thank you for staying up so late your time. I know we've been excited to have you on the show. We've just been trying to figure out how to get the time zone schedules to align for us. So glad you can be with us from the other side of the world as if we're sitting next together today for a great conversation. And I'm really excited to dive into this today. There's so much, especially ESG related, that I want to unpack and get through this very quickly. But before I get there, I need my audience to understand your background experience to sort of set up who you are today and how you're focused on corporate governance. So if you would just sort of start with us for how your career began.
Yes, absolutely. And before you and your audience start guessing my accent, I'm actually German originally. So I started my career as an entrepreneur in Germany in 2007. I ran a few local businesses there and then moved into organizational consulting in 2012. So that's pretty much 10 years ago now. I changed country as well. I moved to Switzerland and helped a large British HR solutions company set up shop in Switzerland. And we were looking at the deliverable component of corporate strategy for mainly banks and helping them with technology projects. And then a few years later, I moved into a different company. I'm now being based in Singapore. I had a few other countries in between, but I'll save you the details. So I spent most of the last 10 years in human capital management, organizational strategy. And around 2006, I personally got interested in sustainability and ESG. Back then, it was still called CSR, and I had the great pleasure to volunteer with a few educational charities in London, actually, and one was Mayor of London. And for the first time, I had that experience that there is more to business than just profits. I was working with underprivileged kids, teenagers, and how business can help drive their career and drive their future prospects. So from that point onwards, I started asking more questions in my professional career when I was speaking to leaders, when I was speaking to CEOs, about their corporate strategy, how much of that sustainability, of that CSR or ESG component do you actually pay attention to? And then when you roll out your strategies, how much of that actually translates down into your organization? And you probably guessed it, often the answer was, we do something about that. We have a report. We have a person that looks into this. It's not so important for our discussions today. Let's focus on how you can help us deliver that strategy. Let's focus on, who we need to deliver that strategy. What is the budget that we need? What is the sort of composition of people?
Right.
So then I was thinking, I can't really live with that going forward. I can't help corporations achieve their strategy and not think outside the box. How does that purpose translate into what companies do all day, every day? So I teamed up with a few people who are experts in that field, and luckily I had a friend here in Singapore, where I'm based now, who is a sustainability expert and an impact measurement expert. And then we were teaming up with another person that we know back from Europe, who is an independent consultant working for the United Nations, focusing on policy. And of course, we were speaking to a few corporate governance experts, non-executive directors, people on boards, because we thought the board of directors really is the ultimate body of supervision for your corporate strategy, right? These are really the people who should pay attention to what the CEOs and what the leaders in the corporations do. So are they aware of that missing sustainability and ESG component in so many corporations and companies? And this is how we started the Sustainability Board Report 3 years ago, which in its first edition was looking at, do you have a sustainability committee on board level? And that is not only a dedicated sustainability committee, but that could also be a corporate governance, risk or audit committee that has ESG and sustainability stipulations as part of the governance chart and looks into this. So we started that report, how many of the 100 largest boards in the world actually have this supervision in form of a charter, in form of policy. And then as a second step, we were looking at how many of these directors on these committees actually have the ESG consciousness or competence to actually supervise that, right? If you look at your audit committee, you would expect everybody on that committee to be a finance expert, I would assume, or at least have a very literate understanding of how corporate finance works. But what we found really was that on these sustainability or ESG committees, the literacy, if you will, of this topic was quite low. And now, in our third year, we're going into our sixth report. We have done a lot of research in between. We have connected with a lot of people. We have a great internal advisory board. We have a lot of collaborators that help us develop our research. And I'm very sure I gave you a far too long answer now for your question.
No, that was a wonderful, comprehensive beginning. And I suppose we should also clarify is that you guys produce an annual report, just as you talked about for these top 100 public companies, where you're sort of tracking the growth and development. So you've done 3 years of that. And before I just even ask you to give a high-level overview of that, I would say for our audience, when we think about ESG, this is such a confusing thing for so many people. We can all agree what the letters stand for, but it's different by industry. It could be different by companies within an industry. How do you cover it? Where do you cover it? Do you have a separate committee? What committee is it under? How does it work? And not only that, just the evolution of companies paying attention to it and being more diligent and aware of it. So Fredrik, even if you just think about the 3 annual reports of these top 100 public companies, I'm sure you're seeing certain trends. Could you give some ideas for us of the progress that we're seeing?
Yes, absolutely. And when you look at this corporate governance policy, and that is often the charters of the committees, that is often when you can look under the hood, as the English say, of what's really going on the board and what's really going on in meetings. And you can see how much a company means it just by how well written that documentation is. So the companies that have a high ESG sentiment generally in the market, where people know this is a good company, I know this company does good, they have a very comprehensive sustainability strategy, they tend to also on board level have a quite comprehensive policy in stipulating the material issues for the business. And then the companies where the general public would have a lower ESG sentiment, often also translate into a more boilerplate stipulations or just the word ESG or sustainability in that board policy. Again, that is often the committee charters that reflect that. So it is quite fascinating on how well a company actually performs in ESG and sustainability and how that link is to good corporate governance policy. There's a clear link that we can see. Another key finding is that we found early on in our first report, which we have been confirming over the last 3 years, is that women are really driving the conversation on ESG and sustainability. There is a clear trend that women have a better understanding, have more care for these issues. And when I speak to people outside of research assignments or so that conduct, educational programs or that are sustainability consultants themselves, they often also confirm these findings subjectively, saying, yes, most of my peers or most of the people that are competent in these areas actually happen to be women, if I think about it now. So these are the sort of two key themes that we've been seeing over the last 3 years. And luckily, we are also seeing that the quality of the disclosures is increasing. And again, this is just based on the last 3 years. So we would hope in another 10 years' time or so, we will eventually have the ESG competent boards that we want. But we are definitely seeing a positive trend. Unfortunately, Asia, to point out a negative, is quite behind on most of this. The Western world does much better.
Well, I mean, we have to put that into context as well, Fredrik. I mean, all progress is good, and many people would say this. We've talked about a couple of things here, like, say, diversity in a boardroom. I think that is proven, not just male, female, but all sorts of backgrounds, right, are helpful to the board in general. It's fascinating to hear your perspective that, certain types of people, and I guess we shouldn't be too surprised, might be better focused on different topics. But when I think about different companies and industries, some are trying, but this is really hard stuff. There was a great article in the New York Times in early December about how hundreds of companies promised to help save the forests. Companies like Nestle, Carrefour, Cargill, and they pledged to reach net zero deforestation in their supply chains by 2020. And it's almost impossible to prove that throughout the entire supply chain. You have to know layer upon layer upon layer of people that are selling to other people along the way and how to prove it. Some made great progress, but they don't know if they're going to get all the way. So you must probably see some companies go like, these are doing great stuff, but it's going to be really hard to get. They got to 80% really well. To get the last 20% is going to be very difficult. What is the sort of guidance you're giving to people that are trying to be the best companies in the industry doing all of this?
Well, you hit the nail on the head, Alexander. It is really, really hard, right? It is not easy to change a board. You got term limits, you got political sensitivities you have to be mindful of. You have various pressures on the board from various stakeholders. You can't just rip out certain people, swap them out. There's a process to that, of course, right? And so it's very hard from a people perspective to start with. But there is, of course, an opportunity for more diverse board for when you have an opening. Be more mindful of the profile that you might want to go for. If you are, I'm not sure who minted this term, but stale, male, and pale board. If you're one of those, then you might want to look into probably a little different profile for your board composition. Secondly, what is a relatively easy thing to do is to get the general documentation right. I don't think it's very difficult to write up a good charter, a good corporate governance policy that stipulates exactly what you want to do with the issues being material to your business. We still see so much boilerplate. I'm sure every large company has a good corporate lawyer who can help with just drawing up a good charter, some good policy, and quite frankly, make yourself accountable, right? So become more accountable in general, not only to your people internally, but of course also to investors, also to governments, and again, other stakeholders. We see obviously the activist investors rising more and more. I think there's quite a lot of defense mechanisms that a company can take just by following a couple of simple steps. So first of all, really paying more attention to the board composition as openings become available. Secondly, just get that documentation in order. And then thirdly, I think what becomes more and more important as well is engaging more with management on the corporate strategy. Where in our corporate strategy is our accountability and our ambition resembled in terms of sustainability and ESG? And from the examples that you have just given, is that something that has ever been talked about with management? Is management aligned with the board of what they want to do in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3 to get to that last 20%, as you said? So I think just a good revision and, taking stake of what's going on and bringing the house in order, if you will, goes a long way. And you'd be surprised how many multinational conglomerates are still out there that do not have the basics right.
Sure. Well, Fredrik, let's think about this. Let's tie together what you talked about in the very beginning of this episode with the past and the future, which you guys have a great report about. So in the past, you talked about how this personal feeling you had of like, this really can't be good enough. Companies can do better. And so it was probably thrilling for you within the last few years when the Business Roundtable here in America actually said, business isn't just about making profits. There's more to it that we have to think of a larger set of society in the world and different stakeholders. It's probably music to your ears. And you guys have this great report you put about sustainable business leadership in 2030, and I'd love to spend a bunch of time on that now. When I try to think about it, you're basically exploring the future of sustainable business leadership, and this is wonderful. So there are 4 scenarios which I'm going to ask you to describe for us, and then we'll do a deep dive into the one about the boardroom. But let's set the scene. If you could talk about those 4 scenarios for us and give an overview of the report first, and then we'll do a deeper dive.
Absolutely. So thanks for teeing me off with this. Of course, the initial report that I was mentioning with the ESG preparedness details of boards is a very data-driven and factual exercise. It's a lot of research, it's a lot of adjudication, looking over the data, reviewing the data, making sure we got everything right. So within the team, we thought, wouldn't it be a great exercise to look into the future and not rely on facts at all, and just really reminisce and look forward to what could happen in 2030. How does the leadership component change? Let's forget about policy and governance and so on for a second, and we'll come back to that. But what does the leadership look like? Who are the leaders, the sustainable leaders of the future? And we were teaming up with really a fantastic panel of experts, all very accomplished people in their individual fields, and we had a guide, Trudy Lang, a fellow of the Said Business School, University of Oxford, who was helping us putting the pieces together. And we did the 4 scenarios that we arrived that we all felt were plausible in 2030 of the leaders arising. The sustainable business leaders are ESG entrepreneurs. These are your activist employees. These are your heads of ESGs or sustainability officers who want to make a change, who come through and really become quasi-leader of the business as they convince management and the board to do more about sustainability. So it's not just entrepreneurs starting new businesses or so, but it's also intrapreneurs, ESG entrepreneurs, activist employees within corporations. The second scenario is idealist CEOs stepping up and leading the sustainable business narrative, really. These are your tech founders who have a personal passion of, using technology for decarbonization, renewable energy, data-driven other solutions that will help in the future. These are people with very deep beliefs that sustainability is the business opportunity of the future. These are individuals and individual capacity that start their own business or that step up to lead large businesses. Then the third scenario.
Now, Fredrik, I bet a bunch of people here are thinking Elon Musk. Is that the kind of person we should be picturing for an idealist CEO?
Absolutely. And if you deep dive into our report, you will also find that there are dangers, of course, in every scenario. And one of the dangers of the idealist CEO is potential, infringements of corporate governance, or, not sticking to what you should be doing. And I think potentially people then again will think of Elon Musk and the sort of Twitter history he has. But yeah, that's exactly one of our examples that is not named in the report, but that you could definitely think of. The next scenario would be leading boards, and that tends to be the favorite scenario of corporate governance experts. And these are really boards that, through the pressure of shareholders, are stepping up and making sure that the corporate strategy is aligned to ESG and sustainability factors. And then the fourth scenario is the scenario of governments and stakeholders. These are governments stepping up to the leadership that businesses potentially have not been exercising in 2030, and hence pressuring the business to implement certain new regulatory frameworks. But these are other stakeholders as well. For example, communities, suppliers, companies around the business, stakeholders around the business, stakeholders in a company's transactional environment, such as NGOs, customers, and so on. So these are all four scenarios. They emanate through various pressures in the future and various developments in the future. I don't want to give too much away now, but definitely these are the four sort of main stakeholder groups that we see that are plausible to lead in somewhat 8 to 10 years' time.
Well, I love that as a report, and I love if we could do a deep dive into scenario 3 about leading boards. Clearly very relevant for our audience here. And when I look back, you were talking about pale, male, and stale. So the first major board I was on was a large pension, and it was pale, male, and stale. I was the one who was not stale. I was the young one in the room, but otherwise it was pale, male, and stale. And I was thinking, when you picture an ESG activist, you're thinking the asset owners, pension funds, insurance companies, endowments, people like that could advocate for change. So I've sort of been on the other side of it. And board members are feeling that now. There is so much more pressure from so many different stakeholder groups of do what I want. And I'm going to put something on the annual meeting agenda if you don't achieve our goals and do what we mean. If you look back at the old days, if a Vanguard or a BlackRock called up 20 years ago and said, hey, we would like to talk to you, chairman of the board, and about our feelings, people would have said, no, thanks, I don't want to do it. Now they would take that call at the drop of a hat, right? That is a part of a board member to be responsive to people. So that pressure is only ratcheting it up. And I'm sure you're saying that will probably increase even more by 2030. So with that a bit of a backdrop, tell us more about this leading board scenario.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it. We really feel that not only the asset managers, but of course the asset owners, the pension funds, insurances, and so on, who really need the asset managers to adhere to the new fiduciary guidelines that the asset owners have. They really need the asset managers to make sure that the investments are aligned to the ethical standards of their pensioners, for example, right? So it needs the asset managers now have collected so much money and have really are so powerful in this dialogue with boards that boards can't really ignore that. They have to do something. We see more and more activist investors stepping up now. Of course, the famous example is the engine number one campaign with ExxonMobil last year. We've seen how the small activist investor changed 3 board members, and that's going to happen more and more. And we feel that we see already this panning out in various areas. And this scenario of leading boards is the ultimate result of what we see what is starting right now. So the ESG investors requiring their portfolio businesses to align with the ESG market metrics, such as the various ratings as well, right? That's another one. You now need to make sure that you rate along the various assessors out there in the right way. And I know I'm giving you a very convoluted answer now, but at the end of the day, we have still the agency of the board here. So the board really needs to be the advocate for the investors and make sure that the management is aligned with that the corporate strategy plays into the hands of. Sorry, I'm losing the plot now, Alexander. I don't know why this is so difficult.
Well, Fredrik, you described a really interesting one. As we said, that Exxon change was world-breaking. It was eye-opening, but in some ways not too surprising that the energy industry would be a target for activists, right? So Royal Dutch Shell, BP, others, we're starting to see a lot more change with these type of companies. And many people would step back and go, well, I guess that makes sense, right? Some people say they're polluting the planet, et cetera. But that's not where it starts and ends. There is so much in every industry we need to change. I talked before about, say, the confectionery companies, right? You think about deforestation that happens around the planet. It's to be able to plant the crops that we need for these sorts of products, right? But what was also fascinating to me in scenario 3, maybe we just spend a few minutes on that, is it's not just the board responding to the activist investors and probably trying to be in the front rather than being responsive, was also, I'm going to say, it talks about a bit of the changed line between where the management is represented by the CEO and the board start and stop. And it sounds like what you're advocating here is the board is going to have to change, at least on ESG, where that red line is and how they work together, and actually being much more involved sort of in the business with the strategy, with the CEO, whereas in the past, the CEO would have said, hey, no, don't come into my space. Tell us more about that part of it.
Yeah, you're making a good point between the individualistic leadership and the systematic leadership. If you have a idealist CEO, for example, you're very reliant on an individual, one person that has certain beliefs or that can make something happen or can't make something happen. Now, the board is a systematic setup, really, is a response to what the market wants, what the investors want, what the shareholders want. But it's a systemic response in that it is not a single individual, but it's a group of people. It's decisions that are being made in a group, and it is a fairly democratic setup. We obviously have voting, we have proposals, we have tenure limits, we have changing policy. And that changing policy is much more systematic and is much more powerful than any individual could ever be. And this is why I think the leading board scenario is a fairly good outlook for 2030, because we have a much more powerful response to sustainable leadership than any one individual could ever have.
Well, Fredrik, the implications of what you're describing are just fascinating and important, right? You think clearly boards are going to be influenced by asset owners' ESG agendas. I think we would all sit here today and say, yeah, we're starting to see that now. It'll be more intense by 2030. But you're talking a more systemic approach to sustainability, maybe blurred lines between management and governance, and more involved board that co-creates business strategy. I think these could be great for so many companies. I'm excited about it. But I want to make sure we spend the last few minutes of today's show not only just talking about this report for 2030, but your most recent report that's just sort of coming out about the world's most future-ready board ratings in terms of ESG board preparedness. If you could just sort of give us a little bit of a teaser about that, your latest report, we'll make sure we're linking to it in the show notes.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Alexander. And we have been aggregating a lot of our data that we've been collecting over the last 3 years to showcase what does good ESG and sustainability governance look like. And what was always very important for our outfit was not to lecture. I hope I didn't come across too lectural today, but we really want to showcase who does it well, and we want to give competitors and peers of companies who do it well the chance to adopt their policy and adopt their leadership to a certain extent. So what we have been creating is a rank list of the 10 most future-ready boards. We had various names. We start with the future-ready now because we think that sums it up quite nicely. And that is a score of the combined ESG preparedness of your board. Takes into consideration your disclosure quality score, what I said at the very beginning. What does your ESG corporate governance look like? What do your charters look like? What is the materiality that is stipulated in your corporate governance policy on board level? The second piece is how competent and conscious in terms of ESG and sustainability are the individual directors who are serving on a respected sustainability or ESG committee, or at a shared committee that has ESG and sustainability as part of it. Then thirdly, how diverse is your board? So we are advertising, an ideal board being 50% male, 50% female in an ideal world. Well, in research and data processing, you need these hard numbers. I think, if you are a board of 10 and you have 6 men and 4 women, you're still doing very well. So the third score is the board diversity score. And the fourth score is the environmental score, which takes into consideration your net zero commitment. So what is your net zero commitment? Do you have milestones on the way to your net zero commitment? And that composes another score. And all of this taken together makes the world's most future-ready boards. And I must admit that within the top 10, we've seen some companies where we weren't surprised, where we already had a very good sentiment of these companies. And we've seen a few where we actually were surprised, which also shows that the general sentiment of whether a company is sustainable or not doesn't always apply. And the leadership of some companies are actually doing really well. And you will find some hidden gems in that rank list. So that was very great to see.
Well, personally, I'm excited to read the report and to be able to see the top 10 list and see who makes it. And I imagine I will be surprised if you are as well, since you were closer to the data. And Fredrik, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thanks so much for having me, Alexander.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Fredrik Otto. I love what they're doing at the Sustainability Board Report. And their annual report is fascinating, the top 100 public companies and how they're doing. Their recent report about sustainable business leadership in 2030 has great insights for the future of the boardroom. And of course, he teased us about the latest report coming out, the world's most future-ready boards ratings of the top 10 most ESG-prepared boards. I'm excited to see who made it and who didn't. So I hope you'll want to dig that up yourself. We'll have links to everything in the show notes, and you'll find that over at podcast.gordon.edu. Please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to Boardroom Bound.